You this morning. Thank you for being here this morning. The session that Phil is doing, he and Nicole and Charlotte are leading the one on General Conference. This is basically what is General Conference, who goes to General Conference, what's the agenda of annual or General Conference when it meets in the last week of April, the first week of May. This is not to get in all the weeds and try to figure out what will and won't happen, because you don't know till you get there, but it is with some anticipation of some of the things that are on the agenda for General Conference. So if you're interested in that, it'll be a great learning experience to do with that. So this morning, I want to start you. Oops, there we go. Oops, wrong one. There we go. All right, around your table, just talk briefly. What is the most difficult, the most unexpected, or the hardest question you have ever been asked? Talk amongst yourselves. Just pick one of them.
Oh.
All right, there are all kinds of things that hit us in life. Oh, you're not through? Go ahead. Y'all were quiet. I thought you were finished. Okay, supposedly Pat has a great question.
Okay, the question is, what's another word for thesaurus and where can I look it up?
Okay. All right, so that was just to kind of get your minds thinking a little bit this morning. I remember, we all have had situations where we've either been put on the spot or someone has asked us a question in front of everyone else that maybe we didn't know the answer to, and everybody assumed we would know the answer to. I remember in college, I was on a trip, a baseball trip, and we had come back late the night before because our van had broken down, as all college vehicles do along the way. Broken down. I didn't get back until like 2:30 in the morning to the campus, and I had not really fully prepared for the class that I was to have at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so being a good college student athlete, I did go to class, but I feared that I would be called upon. Guess who was? Immediately. This was a New Testament Greek class, which in itself at 8 o'clock in the morning is unfair for any reason with that. And so once the professor was aware that I was not prepared, the rest of the morning, I got all the questions. And so it was one of those things, it was just a very awkward thing. I still remember it to this day. That hour was the longest hour in the history of time with that. But we all get questions. And the question that we have come to now here, okay. There we go. That's the question I wanted there. There we go. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked this of his disciples, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" This is really an interesting setting. It's an interesting situation. We're going to take a look at a couple, as you just saw, a couple of pictures of Caesarea Philippi and the experience there. But this is a significant turning point in the Gospel of Matthew. This one leading question in this one setting is the beginning of the end. It is at this point that Jesus turns his sights on Jerusalem. Everything has happened. You can see we're in the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. We're getting to the end, towards the end of moving towards Holy Week and all that. And so he asked this at this particular time, seemingly kind of a question that is fairly easy to answer because you're giving your perspective on it. But at this point, this begins the end of the walk to Jerusalem. So now when he asks this question, he's asking a perspective question. You know, what are you hearing about me out there, guys? Tell me what you know the people are thinking and talking about. And so I want to show again, maybe. Okay, change it. There we go. This is a picture we have seen before of, this is Mount Hermon, which is hard to believe in this picture. And this is not a doctored picture. This is 35 miles away from the Sea of Galilee, which I am on right now. Here is the Greek Orthodox Church at Capernaum. And you can see kind of the perspective of that. Mount Hermon is 9,000 feet tall. And so the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. So in this 35 miles from the time you leave the Sea of Galilee and going north, or going from north to south, you traverse this time. Now, obviously, it's not 9,000 feet tall at Caesarea Philippi, but Caesarea Philippi is at the foot of Mount Hermon. And if you'll move to the next slide there, you can see here is the Sea of Galilee. This is where I am right here on the boat. You can see me right there where that A is. And you're looking north to Caesarea Philippi here. You can see all of the familiar places, Capernaum, which is there. You've got Nazareth, which is down here. So all these are familiar places for us as we look towards this. And this is a transitional area here. If you move to the next slide here, Jesus was withdrawing. You know, it's one of those things that Jesus was famous for it. At moments, he would withdraw from the crowds and he would find a place that's kind of isolated away that he could be with the disciples. And so Jesus withdrew from the Jewish region, which was around the Sea of Galilee, which really was a mixed area, but still was primarily a Jewish area. And he goes up into this quiet place to get away. And it's for those of you that have experienced this trip too, it's just a wonderful kind of rolling hills moving up into the mountain area there. And so he finds this time to get away. This area is mostly populated, as we said, by Gentiles. It's also a very interesting place for Jesus to go because this is Caesarea Philippi is a center for pagan worship. Pagan worship. And Jesus is taking the disciples up to this area. And it's a dramatically powerful place to ask the questions that he's asking. And whether it was coincidental along the way or whether it was an intention to be at that place to ask this question is very interesting. This is by nature, by history, by tradition, the birthplace of the god of nature, Pan. Pan is the keeper of the gates to hell. And so Jesus asked them at this place, who do the people say that I am? Standing with the backdrop, the gate of hell, right behind you in that place. This is the only account that we have in the Gospels that Jesus goes to this place. So whether this was, again, a happenstance, we're out walking around for 35 miles and end up in Caesarea Philippi, or whether the intent was really to give us the message, which is what I think, to proclaim who Jesus is as the Messiah for the very first time in the scriptures in a way that dramatically moves us toward all the events that are going to follow. There is no turning back at this point. The proclamation has been made. So the next picture gives you a little bit of a drawing here over what Caesarea Philippi may have looked like. This is artist rendition of this. First of all, you got over here, this is a temple to Caesar Augustus. So Caesar has decided this place is one of the places that I need a place to remember me. We also have the grotto behind it, and you'll see a picture of it in real life in a minute. But this is a cave in the back of here that is the gate to hell. This is where Pan controls the chaos that comes in and out of the world. And so that's back here. And then we have next to it the court of Pan, which is right here. And then we have next to it the temple of Zeus, which is here. And then we have the court of Nemesis, which is right here. And then on the side of that is the tomb temple of the sacred goats. And then here on this right here, we have the temple of Pan and the dancing goats. So goats are very important, obviously, to this. And so we have these places that are all represented as pagan worship places to lift up the gods of the Greek and the Roman history, but also Caesar Augustus, who proclaims as the emperor himself to be the god. And so moving next on then to, now that we know the setting a little bit here, and then they said, some say that you're John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah as one of the prophets. He said to them, here's the zinger, but okay, that's who they say I am. Now, who do you say that I am? You've been spending all this time with me. You've seen everything that's happened and everything that's been done. Now the time is, tell me what you think. What have you seen and what have you done? And then obviously Simon Peter answers, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. as compared to some of the ancient gods which live in other places. And so who do you others say that I am? Jesus did not ask this question because he didn't know who he was. This was, or because he was concerned about what others were saying about him. Like John the Baptist, some thought Jesus was seeking national repentance. One of the things that the people were always concerned about is how can we be in right relationship with God, and this as much as a nationalistic thing as it was a religious thing. Like Elijah, some thought Jesus was a worker of miracles. He had already performed miracles all over, so maybe that's what his role is. Like Elijah, he is going to perform miracles. Jeremiah, some thought Jesus was someone who spoke the word of God, and so he spoke for God. And he asked these questions to set up the next question, which is a deeper and a more important one, and that's the one we go to next. But who do you say that I am? Jesus assumed that the disciples would not have the same answer as the people would have, because they've gotten to know him. They've seen the things that have taken place with that. Peter knew more than Jesus about that Jesus was more than John the Baptist or Elijah the prophet. He was more than a national reformer, more than a miracle worker, more than a prophet. He was the Messiah, the living Son of God. He was God himself in our presence. And then moving to the next picture here, you'll see the gates to hell here. One of the things that over history and time, this used to be a deep, deep crevice in there. For those that you have been there, you know it's not anymore. It's filled in, and that's because of earthquake over history and time. But originally, it was a deep, deep crevice that supposedly, if you threw a rock in or you threw something in, you never heard it hit. You didn't hear a sound of it hitting the bottom. It just kind of went on and on and on. And so that's how it got its reputation, that it must be to the center of where Hades is, because the door is open for that. Moving to the next picture here, you see the remnants of a pagan worship place. This is where idols would have been put up on the face of the facade that is there, just as a reminder, as you come to worship Pan or you come to worship other gods, you would see that there as a way to, again, have an altar to worship. Then moving on to the 17th through the 20th verses here. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth, you will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So moving on in the slides here, Jesus reveals that Peter has spoken what is a divine interpretation of who he is, even though Peter doesn't really fully understood what he just said. Jesus implies to us that God is the one who has spoken through Peter. That Peter had revealed to him in this moment a divine revelation that he shares. This is the only recognition. Bless you.
Oh, thank you.
This was the only recognition of Peter's Roman name that we have. Obviously, we remember Saul and Paul in history. One was a Roman name, one was the Hebrew name. Peter's name, obviously, is also here. So God would transform Peter's extreme character into something solid and reliable. And again, this is one of those things, the transition kind of Peter at this point, not in totality, but to a deeper understanding of who God is, and one that is not quite as off the wall as some would think. Peter, in his own testimony, wrote that this was wrote that we are all living stones. Jesus is the cornerstone. He was the first rock among many rocks. And so Peter pretty much says all of us can be the rock for God, can be the rock for Jesus as we proclaim, that all of us have that capability. Again, some of us have divine as well as human characteristics that we can share. We all do that. And then Jesus talks about building his church. This is the first use of the word ecclesia. That is a Greek word that I learned in college. No. At 8 o'clock in the morning, which means group or called out group. It didn't really have a connotation of church as we traditionally know it until it got used in this context. Prior to that, it was just a word. Ecclesia was a group, more so than a religious name that was put upon it. And this is the first time in the entire book that this is referred to as the church. It's used throughout Acts. We see ecclesia mentioned a lot there, and God gave the word, Jesus did, basically a new meaning from what had been the traditional secular context into what we would call the church context with that. We talk about even today, the church is the ecclesia of Christ. And so Jesus brings his people together in a common thing by saying, I'm going to build this church. Jesus builds on the firm foundation, and that on the rock, this rock, I will build my church. And then Jesus builds something that belongs to him. He talks about my church with that. And so Jesus builds the church into a stronghold. The gates of hell cannot prevail against this. At no time can this be taken over historically with this. Jesus builds something that can never fail. Forces of death and darkness can't destroy it. So the church is established at this point and will continue to be until Christ comes back, and then we are all a part of the eternal church with that. And then he talks about an interesting thing. He says, I will give you to Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven. The idea of Peter holding the keys of heaven implies that he's a gatekeeper. And this is kind of a pearly gate experience that we talk about, that Peter has the authority to determine who can come in and out of heaven, which is really more of a Catholic belief than in reality with that. But that's how we first got to know this. You're given the key to the kingdom. And so you can be the gatekeeper with this. Peter was the first pope of the church. And that he would hand down the keys to his successors. But this is really not found in the Bible. This is not a scripturally defined thing. It's just something that has happened over history and time. And there's a lot of debate about whether Peter really had the authority to pass the key to the kingdom from one pope to the next with that. So, but again, this is the Catholic tradition that many of us have grown up with understanding. Peter also had a special place among all the disciples. Peter was that special relationship. The Bible talks about John being the beloved disciple of Jesus. But in a lot of ways, too, we understand and know that Peter himself had a very special place. He was always the first one to be listed anytime you see a list of the disciples. Peter's name is always the first one. And so he opened the doors of the kingdom to the Jews in Acts, and he also opened it to the Gentiles in Acts. So part of the role of Peter from Christ's understanding is he would be the one to issue the universal invitation. He and Paul took on this role. And if you remember, Paul and Peter had to finally come to an understanding of who was going to be the head of what. And that's how the Orthodox Church came to be. Peter is the head, the first pope of the Catholic Church. Paul was the first pope of the Orthodox Church. And that was the church of the Gentiles. So Peter is basically the church of the Jews who have become Christians. Paul is the one that's the head of the church of the Gentiles who have become Christians. And that was how they kind of came to an understanding. We're not in competition, we're just in serving kind of different communities. And so we're going to do our things and kind of you stay out of my way and I'll stay out of your way a little bit. But also that gave people somebody to relate to with. Yeah. In the New Testament, that is by tradition. And again, whether he physically wrote them, whether he dictated them, whether he did a combination of both. We know he wrote some parts of it because he says, I, Paul, am writing this to you. But whether that's true even, we know. But it's, there's 18 books in the New Testament that, if I remember my math correctly, that are attributed to Paul. Of that, and 12 of them pretty much we can say, yeah, Paul wrote these. The others maybe we have some questions about. But one of the things that we talked about was Peter is at this point the rock and the foundation of the church. So if you go to Capernaum, you'll see a statue there of Peter, and we know it's Peter for a couple of reasons. One is where it is because it's at Capernaum, which was Peter's home. You remember Peter's mother-in-law is mentioned there. But you also see this statue here, and there's a couple of things that tell us who this is. The first picture is of this statue of Peter holding the keys to the kingdom. Anytime you see Peter, he's going to be holding keys. And that's in icons as well as in statues or whatever you might see. These are the keys to the kingdom in whatever way they might find. We also know this is Peter because the next picture shows us a fish at his feet. And why does that get put there? This is a St. Peter's fish, which is its home base is in the Sea of Galilee. And if we've talked before, you can go there and you can have a Peter fish for dinner or lunch if you would like. And you can get it with or without the head, depending upon your preference with that. But this is a St. Peter's fish with that. And then the next picture is of the church that is there. This is St. Peter's Church. It looks like kind of like a spaceship. It was built in 1968 is when it was finished with a modern Catholic church that is at Capernaum. It's absolutely gorgeous on the inside, and the inside of it has a glass floor where you can look down underneath that church at the home of Peter's mother-in-law, the traditional site of her home. And so the remnants of that home are there. You can see it from the outside, but you can also see it on the inside of the church. The floor just opens up kind of in that area. So you get to see that. We move on then to the next part of that scripture passage. It says, whatever you bind, whatever you loose. Binding and loosing were originally related to the rabbinic law. To loose was to permit something. If you loose it up, you allow it to happen. If you bind it up, you prohibit it. To loose was to be free from the law. To bind was to be put under the law. So there were all these practical things. If you remember, there are over 600 rabbinic laws that were to be lived by the Jews. And so they would come and ask questions, and they would say, okay, we're going to make a law about that. And they would add the law to the many laws that were already there. Started with 12, ended up with over 600. Because all of these things had to be decided by somebody, and the rabbinic law was then created to give us that. But one of the things I thought that was interesting is dealt with daily issues. So this one I thought was an interesting one. What do you do if your dog dies? If your dog dies, are you clean or are you unclean? You know, historically, Jews had nothing to do with dead bodies. With that, that's why you got buried the same day that you died, because it was to be kosher because of that. There was also certain times you could and could not bury someone. But the interesting thing of this law was that if your dog dies, whether it's clean or unclean depends on where it died. If it dies in your house is unclean. If it dies in your yard, you're okay, it's clean. But what happens if the dog dies on the threshold between inside and outside? How do you decide whether it's clean or not? The law is, it depends on which way its nose is pointing. If the nose is pointing inside, then you're unclean. If it's pointing outside, you're clean. See, this is important stuff to know with that. But anyway, that's part of the law with that. And then ultimately, but that's what binding and loosing meant. So when you read this passage, that's what they're talking about. Is this something that binds us up under the law, or is this something that is not law? And if it's not law, then we're loosed up, or if we're okay with that. So, and then finally, to tell no one. Jesus was pleased that the disciples were coming to know who he was, but Jesus also didn't want them going out blabbering it before they really had a true understanding of this. And so he says to them, and maybe that's what's easy about being at Caesarea Philippi. Who are they going to tell? They're in a pagan worship place. And this is not the people that have been following him, that are around him at this point. So maybe one of the reasons to tell them this place and then say, but don't tell anybody yet, is that, again, this begins the march to Jerusalem. This is going to take us down through Samaria, all the way into Jerusalem, and through Jericho, up into Jerusalem. And all along the way, Jesus is going to encounter the woman at the well. He's going to encounter Zacchaeus. He's going to encounter the blind man, Bartimaeus, to be healed. And all of that is on the way to Holy Week with that. So you have these questions up on the screen. If you were asked by Jesus, who do the people of Dunwoody say that the Son of Man, Jesus, is, what would you say? If you had to have a statement about who we are in understanding who Jesus is, each day we are asked by Jesus, but who do you say that I am? And that's one of those theological things. You know, Jesus has put it to the disciples, but ultimately he puts it to us day to day. Who do you say that Jesus is today in your life? And how do you relate to that? And Jesus often instructed his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. Again, why was that? What exercises do we use or excuses do we use for why we don't tell people about Jesus? So talk amongst yourselves.